Hi. Um, I think it's probably timely to do a little update on my thoughts on the war between Israel and Gaza, between Israel and Hamas, um, the October 2023 Holy Land War. What's this war going to be called? And, what's it going to be designated as when history is written? Because different conflicts, get tied with different names. So I wonder what this one's going to be called. The I think probably the 2023 Israel-Hamas war being the year it specifically started. Of course, the background and the origins go well back beyond October 2023, but this latest really major escalation did begin on October the 7th, 2023. And in for context, even if you take more conservative figures of how many have died in this violence, it amounts to at least half of all those who have died in the Israel-Palestinian conflict in the last 50 years. In other words, more people have died in the last, say, October, this is January, 3 months, than all the violence between Israel and the Palestinians in the last 30, 40, 50 years. And that's no exaggeration if you look at the cumulative fatalities. This is deadlier than the Yom Kippur War, it's deadlier than the Six-Day War, and all within the space of a few months. Um, I haven't done a U-turn. I still feel that Israel has a fundamental right to go after Hamas, and I think that when it comes to the Holy Land, if people, the Near East, for want of a better term, if people, look at this in terms of the sheer numbers, then obviously far more Palestinians have died, as is usually the case. In the beginning, it was the other way around, where for a brief period it was more Israelis. Um, Israel suffered, the IDF suffered its worst losses the other day when I believe 21 soldiers died in one day when a building came down on them. So it's also proving costly for the IDF. But the toll on Palestinian civilians is severe, really severe. And even if you consider that the figures may be exaggerated because the Gaza Health Ministry is run by Hamas, I think just common sense shows that with the level of bombing that Israel has done, the toll is going to be severe for civilians, given the densely populated nature of the strip. Um, it's no one could deny that there has been far too many civilian dead in this war. And I'm uneasy about it. It depresses me. It makes me very uncomfortable. Um, but this situation, it's just taken a new turn because South Africa is really pushing for its genocide case against Israel. Now, I was looking at the proceedings yesterday from the International Court of Justice, I believe, in The Hague. I've been there actually, not in the court buildings themselves, but I've been in The Hague, outside where the courts are. Um, and the thing is, this is, you really need to understand the different layers of how this is processed, because it's just to get to the preliminary stage of even considering a case is highly complex, as it should be, because these are very serious allegations. Genocide is probably the worst crime known to humanity. I mean, I don't think literally you could get any worse than that. So to make that charge is a very serious thing indeed. South Africa's push for this. Now, on the surface, one may ask, what's South Africa doing? It's thousands of miles from this situation. Why is it sticking its neck out? Because South Africa's not that outspoken on other international issues. It tends to be non-aligned or kind of passive. Well, when you look a bit deeper, it's not that surprising. South Africa is governed by the ANC. The ANC has always been well to the left on international affairs. During the apartheid years, it was pro-communist often. It always sympathised with left-wing global movements, and inevitably they associate themselves with the Palestinians' cause. Now, I come from Northern Ireland, and during the Troubles, there was also a divide on the Unionist side and the Nationalist side regarding the conflict in the Holy Land. So the Nationalists, Irish Republicans, would kind of um, associate themselves with Palestinians and Arabs, and Unionists, to a lesser extent, would associate themselves with Israel and the Jewish cause. although no doubt there'd be pockets of anti-Semitism in unionist quarters as well. But um, it's like no other war in the world, even Russia and Ukraine, which has got significant international debate. There is no other war in the world that polarizes international opinion to the same extent as the war between Israel and its neighbours, and particularly between Israel and the Palestinians. And I think there is an international divide whereby Western democracies tend to support Israel, and the so-called global South tends to be more pro-Palestinian. Um, but this is not a black and white situation. Innocent people have suffered on both sides. Now, regarding the genocide claim, again, I'm not a jurist, I'm not a legal expert, and this is a very, very complex thing to get through all of the areas of how that is properly defined. But very loosely speaking, it's an attempt, the legal definition would be an attempt to eradicate a people in whole or in part, to just eradicate them, like a specific targeting of people based on their ethnicity or other characteristics. That's why the genocide claim has been leveled against China, because it's specifically targeting Uyghur Muslims, against Burma because it's targeting the Rohingya minority, and there can be a claim also leveled against Russia in its deportation of Ukrainian children. I think certainly some of the things that Russia has done in Ukraine could be borderline genocidal when Russia's questions Ukraine's very existence. Um, and yet some would argue against it, saying, well, they're Russians and Ukrainians are both Slavic people, so there isn't a racial component there, and many Ukrainians are Russian speakers. That's where things get complicated. Um, the term genocide, as I understand it, was coined at the beginning of the 20th century, and the first designated genocide doesn't mean the first genocide in history, but the first designated genocide, if I recall correctly, was the killing of the Herero people in German West Africa in 1906, 1907, or around that period. It was the targeting of them for basic German imperialism. But what the Belgians done in the Congo was even on a much, much bigger scale. It's said to be one of the most successive of all the European colonial powers. Somewhere in the region of 8 million Congolese died on rubber plantations serving Leopold II's Belgian imperial dynasty. And that was horrendous. Um, so the term genocide, sort of, I think it was coined early 20th, late 19th century. Um, but it does have a very specific meaning. Now, what the South African contingent would have to prove is that Israel is deliberately trying to wipe out Gazans as a people or mass deport them. Now, this is going to be a long process. This is not something that can be proven overnight, no matter how much violence is there, because there'll be claims and there will be counterclaims. I do think there are some far right figures in Netanyahu's cabinet who have made dehumanizing statements about the Palestinians. Certainly, there's far right settlers who would have that mentality. And I'm not a fan of Netanyahu. I think he's emboldened these people. Bear in mind, before this war broke out, Netanyahu himself was on the cusp of being kicked out in Israel. Um, so, even within Israel, Netanyahu's a highly controversial figure. Sometimes wars kind of galvanize leaders and they give support to leaders. In this case, it's had the opposite effect. Netanyahu continues to be controversial in Israel, particularly the families of the hostages. Now, they tend to be on the left side of Israeli politics, so they wouldn't have been fans of Netanyahu in the first place, and they feel that he is not prioritizing the hostages. I'm not sure that Israel is prioritizing them. I think a lot of this campaign is about revenge against Hamas for what happened on October the 7th. I'm not sure how much effort they're actually putting into getting those hostages. I would like to think that they are, but and it's not a simple thing. It's definitely not a simple thing. No one should assume that they could just go in and take them. But Israel is in a position whereby it said that it wants to destroy Hamas. That's understandable. But unfortunately, Hamas is the very people that they're the only people that can release the hostages. I know Qatar is playing a mediation role. I hope all of these people, or as many of them as possible, are released. Sadly, some of them will have died either in Israeli airstrikes or they'll have been executed by Hamas. But, the psychological strain on those people, there's been reports of Israeli women raped, young girls, teenage girls forced to dress up, and it's sickening the sort of things that are going on there. They will have post-traumatic stress for years and years. It must be gut-wrenching for the families to be sitting there not knowing what's happening to their loved ones. It is horrendous. And I note even the South African delegation were careful to say that they didn't condone Hamas taking hostages, and it was appalling. Although one thinks they kind of put that as a caveat rather than, they sort of put it as a disclaimer rather than they were really, they're certainly not anti-Hamas to the extent that they should be. Um, I do feel I have very mixed feelings on this at the moment. Part of me thinks Israel is going too far. I mean, every hospital in Gaza has been destroyed or severely damaged. Now, it's all very well telling people to go elsewhere, but they literally have nowhere else to go. I do think there is a question about Arab states. If they have so much solidarity with the Palestinians, why isn't Egypt opening its borders? Is it because Egypt doesn't want to have to deal with Hamas? They don't want terrorist attacks on Egyptian soil? Um, but it does kind of put the so-called solidarity for Palestinians into the spotlight a little bit. If there is so much solidarity there, why are Arab states not offering them help? I know you could argue that the Houthis, the whole thing about attacking shipping, is supposedly solidarity for Hamas, not for the Palestinian people. And the Houthis, like Hamas, have a virulently anti-Semitic worldview. This is the thing that really bothers me when people, you know, show ignorance about these groups. They think they're just resistance fighters. They ignore the fact that they are virulently anti Semitic. They're not saying they're against the Israeli government, they're saying they're against Jews, all Israeli citizens. All, if they had their way, they'd kill every Jew on the planet. That's something that has to be understood. Now, that is genocidal intent. Hamas absolutely has genocidal intent. So, given that Hamas is the authority that runs Gaza, what about the genocide claims against them? I mean, that is empirically provable because it is in their very charter that they want to wipe out Jews. I mean, it is in their charter, it's in their founding principles. And this is why a ceasefire is overly simplistic. All those calling for a ceasefire, will Hamas abide by that? And will they, dispense of their vows to kill every Israeli? They won't. This is the problem. So if Israel is obliged to uphold a ceasefire, Hamas might abide by it for a short time, but they're not going to get rid of the genocidal intent. And I think Netanyahu's government's taken the view this was a massive blow that we took on October the 7th. And this time, we're not going to have just the operation as usual whereby we hit back and then it goes back to square one. I think they meant it when they said we're going to finish Hamas once and for all. And of course, that's going to be a bigger campaign. But I think Israel is losing the international PR campaign. Even allies are uneasy about what's happening because simply too many civilians have died. And it's no good saying, oh, well, Hamas uses them as human shields. Israel can do a lot more, I think, I'm very skeptical of the heavy bombing campaign. Inevitably, that's going to cause heavy civilian deaths. Israel says that it's doing everything in its power to assist humanitarian efforts. Not the whole way, it hasn't. When the UN was trying to get in there, Israel wasn't exactly being helpful in the beginning. Now, I think that Israel does have a moral right to go after Hamas. Um, I think that, holding this standard to Israel that it cannot defend itself, and if it does, then it's a villain, is fundamentally unreasonable. I would make the point to South Africa. Let's say, for example, we know that there's an ISIS offshoot, has been active in Mozambique in recent years. Now, let's say that really escalated and it spilled into South Africa's borders. Let's say ISIS went into South African territory and massacred South African nationals. Would the South African government really just sit back and do nothing? Of course not. Any government in the world would act. So I do have a problem with singling Israel out. I'm not saying that Israel can't be criticized. My issue is with the singling of Israel out. Now, the other side of the coin is there are Zionists, there are pro-Israelis who are just blind in terms of their dogmatic support, and they will basically be okay with anything. I do think they are guilty of dehumanizing the Palestinians. They don't care how many Palestinians die. I do think I've seen it. There are Zionists who have that mentality, and I'm not okay with that. I do not endorse that. I do not agree with that. I think fundamentally, this might sound overtly sentimental or something, but a Palestinian child and an Israeli child should be equal. That's just a no-brainer. So I do think some of those who are fiercely pro-Israel, they are guilty of basically disregarding Palestinian suffering. And I know that a lot of that suffering is the result of Hamas. I know this is a situation Hamas brought on, but I do have a problem with just blindly agreeing with Israel. I do have a problem with just blindly defending Israel no matter what it does. I don't agree with that, because I think there are some areas where Israel can be criticised. I think Netanyahu has emboldened far right elements. I think there are some deeply racist Israelis who basically just hate all Arabs. And yes, of course, there's Arabs who hate all Jews as well, but you know, one doesn't sort of mitigate the other. It's definitely a mentality that will not get peace in that part of the world. But um, of course, what's grotesque about all of this is the people who were kidnapped and massacred on October the 7th, they would have been on the left of Israeli politics. They would have been sympathetic to the Palestinians. That's what makes Hamas so despicable. The fact that the very people they targeted they weren't right wing settlers, they were on the left of Israeli politics. That's the cruel irony of all of this. But I will say this: I mentioned like South Africa singling Israel out, and I think others do it as well. But within the West, the hard left does this. I mean, if if someone on the hard left is sort of saying, "Well, Israel's a racist apartheid state," it dehumanizes the Palestinians, it's committing terror on the Palestinians. My question be, well, yes, some of that is true, some of it, but why are you singling Israel out? I mean, why is it that they cannot see what Hamas has done? Why is it they cannot see that Israel is in a situation where it has to take on Hamas? It's no good telling Israel to sue for peace. It's a bit like, the demands made of Ukraine to have peace with Russia. What would that mean? It would mean that they sacrifice their country. Now, I'm not saying the two conflicts are the same, but the ultimatum given to the Ukrainians and the Israelis is unreasonable. In the case of Israelis, it's demanding that they have peace with a terrorist group that want them wiped off the face of the earth. In the case of the Ukrainians, it would be sacrificing their country and then becoming slaves to Putin's tyranny. That's what it means. That's why Trump, if he pushes the Ukrainians to do that, would be an absolute failure of statesmanship. Um, but I hope this all ends soon. Unfortunately, I think it's going to drag on for a long time. It has to be said that South Africa bringing this to the ICJ doesn't mean it's going to happen. It simply means the ICJ is going to remind Israel not, to abide by international law. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything's going to happen. And definitely there is no European country, definitely not the US, Canada, New Zealand, none of them are going to back South Africa's push. Probably you'll find a lot of developing countries will, because like I say, there's a divide there. And it has to be said, anti-Semitism is a real thing. I mean, put it this way, when you see Arab dictators slaughtering their own people, you don't see Islamophobia as a result of that. So why is it when Israel is accused of excesses, then it somehow gives people this green light that they think, oh, well, that's why people don't, it gives them a green light to think they could be anti-Semitic. Um, I will say, though, again, going back to the other side, there are hard right Zionists who will use that as an excuse. Basically, if someone criticizes Israel in any way, shape, or form, they're smeared as an anti Semite. I think that's wrong. There are Jews who criticize Israel. So I do think there are some reactionary conservatives and right wing Zionists and right wing Jews who will immediately, frankly, use the anti Semitism label when Israel's criticized, just like a knee jerk thing. What I say is it's wrong to single Israel out, but the principle of criticizing a government cannot be called discrimination. That's ridiculous. Now, if it's talking about Israelis as people, if it's talking about Jews, yes, that's clear cut anti Semitism. But I do not accept that criticizing the Israeli government is in of itself anti-Semitic. Maybe that becomes a question mark if it's solely focused on Israel. But honestly, I'm maybe in a minority here because this is such a polarizing thing. You either get people who are fiercely pro-Palestinian or fiercely pro-Israel. Now, I wouldn't say I'm in the middle because I believe Israel has a right to go after Hamas. So I'm not smack bang in the middle. But I am not. Put it this way: I'm more, in my mind, I'm more sympathetic to the Ukrainian situation than Israel in the sense that they're different conflicts. You know, the vast majority of the war in Ukraine has been on Ukrainian territory. Some strikes into Russia, but the vast majority of the war has been on Ukrainian soil. Now, Israel is bringing the war to the Palestinians. That's where it is different. Um, Also, in terms of casualties, I think Russian and Ukrainian casualties are probably similar overall. The number of Russian soldiers versus the number of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians. Whereas in this situation, it is the reality that far, far more Palestinians have died. I think Israel is losing the international PR campaign, and I think some of that has been from blind rage. Understandably, they wanted to hit back after October the 7th. But, you know, it's those two extreme positions that I take issue with. On one hand, the hard left who just kind of vilify Israel, they totally disregard the challenges that Israel faces. They totally disregard the genocidal nature of Hamas. Then the other side is those who just blindly agree with everything Israel does, and I do think they are desensitized to Palestinian suffering. They do seem to think that it doesn't really matter. Oh well, it's their own fault, you know. Hamas started this, but that's not good enough. You know, the Palestinians, as they well know, are they're subject to Hamas. You know, it's not like there were some courageous Palestinians recently who protested against Hamas, but you know that's why if you're saying they're slaves of Hamas, well then also further that and say, but it's a tragedy that they're dying. It's I think there is a double standards in terms of how they look at Palestinian civilian dead. I do. And I have a problem with the reactionary mentality of if you criticize Israel, you're an anti Semite. But this conflict is full of double standards. It's full of examples of whataboutery. And I honestly don't know what the best answer is. I think that an absolute ceasefire would disregard the genocidal nature of Hamas. But I think at least there should be some sort of lull in the fighting or something to ease the suffering of the Palestinian people. Um, Israel's basically scorched earth approach to this, I think, is backfiring. And there's no evidence that they have killed apparently a third of Hamas fighters, but Hamas hasn't stopped firing rockets. So it's questionable how effective this military campaign actually is. Leaving aside all the moral questions, is actually stopping Hamas. I mean, can Netanyahu's government say this is actually stopping Hamas firing rockets? Because that surely should be the component of any military action. Likewise, Britain and America would need to say, well, there's a justification in taking strikes against the Houthis, but is it actually stopping them? These questions are never black and white. Again, those leftists who want to condemn Britain and America for retaliating against the Houthis, my question to them is, are you suggesting that this terrorist group be allowed to attack civilian shipping without a response? They should be simply allowed to fire missiles at civilian maritime vessels. It's not Navy ships they're firing at, it's civilian vessels. So how do you justify that? So I am sick and tired of the hard left turning a blind eye to blatant terrorism. And that's clear to see. So that's basically where I lie. I mean, it might seem that my thoughts are contradictory, but honestly, I that's how I feel. I'm I still support fundamentally Israel's right to defend itself, but I do think Israel risks being seen as engaging in collective punishment. I don't think it fits a legal definition of genocide because I don't think there's actually a specific aim to kill all Gazans. But if Israel then was to say we're going to mass deport all Gazans, then yes, there would start to be genocidal tendencies there. in terms of, because genocide isn't just about killing people, it's also about mass displacement and things like that. But it gets into very complex legal territory, which I'm not qualified to talk about. I'm not a jurist. I don't have that qualification. But the most important thing now is Israel has to do a lot more to reduce civilian casualties, and there has to be more pressure on Hamas to immediately release the hostages, immediately, and to relinquish their charter. If they're going to say, well, Israel wants to destroy us, what the hell do they expect? Their state aim is the death of all Jews, the death of all Israelis. So there needs to be much more pressure on Hamas to A, release the hostages, and B, relinquish their charter. I mean, they'll probably never do that. In which case, Israel basically rest easy knowing that there's people next door who want to slit your throat in the middle of the night. It's totally unreasonable to put Israel in that position in that sense. So anyway, that's my take. Let me know your thoughts. It's a very depressing situation. It's the toll is horrendous. 26,000 dead. Um, Even if the figures, that can't be 100% relied on, it's clear that thousands have died. It's been a very, very costly war for a short period of time. Let me know your thoughts.